It was a cold, wet Tuesday in Ridgefield, Oregon, October 15th, 2013. The kind of night when even the regulars skip the bookstore. But Lana Briggs wasn't a regular in the traditional sense. She didn't come for small talk or staff picks. She came for the quiet. Just before 7:30 p.m., she walked into Wren's Books, a locally owned secondhand shop tucked between a laundromat and a tax office. The clerk on duty that night said she barely made eye contact. She wore a hooded green parka, headphones in, her black canvas tote slung over one shoulder. The rain hadn't let up all day, and by the time she walked in, the store had the smell of old paper and damp wool. The security camera, mounted just above the register, showed her spending about 12 minutes inside. No one else entered during that window. She moved deliberately, first toward the classics, then the poetry shelf. At 7:42 p.m., she paid in cash for a dog-eared copy of Letters to a Young Poet and exited through the front door. The clerk remembers the bell chiming and the door sticking briefly as it often did. Then she was gone. Lana Briggs was never seen again. Her car, a 2004 silver Toyota Corolla, was found parked half a block down, facing away from the shop. The doors were locked, and her keys and phone were never recovered. The book she purchased was not in the vehicle. Police noted no signs of struggle inside or around the car. No blood, no dropped belongings, no fingerprints out of place. A neighbor 2 units above the bookstore told police she heard the door chime, then nothing. No voices, no engine, just rain. Investigators canvassed nearby businesses, reviewed traffic cams, and checked for any cab or rideshare activity. Nothing. Her bank accounts were untouched. No social media posts followed. It was as if Lana had evaporated in the 50 feet between the bookstore door and her driver's side door handle. Lana was 24, an introvert by all accounts, but functional. She worked part-time as a barista at Common Grounds Cafe and lived alone in a basement apartment just off Hayward Street. She had no prior history of mental illness, no criminal record, and no immediate signs of distress. Friends described her as sensitive, quirky, maybe a bit emotionally distant, but not unstable. One co-worker mentioned she'd seemed weirdly quiet in the weeks prior, quieter than usual, but no one pressed it. She didn't owe anyone money. She hadn't reported threats. She wasn't in legal trouble. She just disappeared. The town's initial reaction was disbelief. Ridgefield wasn't the kind of place where people vanished. The streets were familiar. The businesses were locally owned. Everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone. But as the days passed and the search expanded, hope began to wither. Flyers went up. Candlelight vigils were held. The woods around the perimeter of town were combed by volunteers and dogs. Divers searched the riverbanks. Lana's family offered a reward. Nothing ever came back. One tip said she'd been seen entering a dark sedan near the post office, but the footage was too blurry to confirm anything. Another said she may have run off to Portland to start over. Her sister publicly dismissed that idea, pointing to a scheduled dentist appointment Lana had booked 2 days after her disappearance. She had plans. Within 3 weeks, the case hit a wall. There was no phone activity, no credit card use, no sign she'd crossed any nearby highway checkpoints or taken a bus. Even the bookstore, her last known location, yielded nothing. No backdoor footage, no loitering strangers, no receipts beyond hers. Just that single 12-minute window where she came in from the rain and never came back out the same. Or if she did, no one saw where she went next. By December, the search efforts had slowed. The detective assigned to the case called it one of the cleanest vanishings he'd seen in 20 years. Lana's file went from active to dormant. In April 2014, with no further leads, the Ridgefield police officially declared her missing under suspicious circumstances. Her parents moved out of town a year later. Her old apartment was rented to a college student. The bookstore remained open. Life, as it always does, began to fold itself over the absence. But in the town's undercurrent, the story lingered. People said maybe she'd planned it. Maybe she met someone online. Maybe she'd been unhappy in ways no one could see. Others whispered darker things about the old man who owned the bookstore or about the alley behind the tax office that never had a working streetlight. A few pointed to another missing person case from decades earlier in Michigan, but no one ever made the link official. Without a body, without evidence, there was nothing left to say. Just rain and silence. Then, 12 years later, when a new owner started clearing out the old bookstore's back storage room, something shifted. A smell, a sealed space no one remembered, and a trunk. The discovery would unravel a truth no one in Ridgefield was prepared to face. In the days after Lana Briggs vanished, Ridgefield police turned inward, into her life, her habits, her mind. She'd lived in apartment 2B of a 4-unit walk-up just 6 blocks from the bookstore. Rent was always on time, no complaints from neighbors. The landlord remembered her as polite, private, and rarely home during daylight. Her windows were always covered, and the lights stayed on late. The apartment itself was neat, sparsely decorated, second-hand furniture, a few thrifted posters, mostly literary quotes. Nothing flashy. The refrigerator held black coffee, oat milk, and hummus. There were no drugs, no alcohol, no medications besides ibuprofen and expired antihistamines. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table, dead. The charger was still plugged into the wall. Detectives interviewed her manager at Common Grounds, who described Lana as reliable, quiet, and not the type to flake. She worked 4 days a week, always the closing shift. Her last scheduled shift was the night before she vanished. She'd clocked out at 10:04 p.m., signed her name on the register tape like always, and left without saying anything unusual. A co-worker mentioned that for the past few weeks, Lana had been keeping her headphones in more often, barely engaging with customers, scribbling into a notebook between orders. The same co-worker recalled her staring out the window one night during cleanup, muttering something about feeling like someone's waiting for her to remember something. At the time, no one thought much of it. Her financial records were unremarkable. She had a checking account with under $800, no savings, and a student loan balance she'd been steadily paying off. Her last transaction was the cash withdrawal at an ATM 3 days before her disappearance, $60. Most of it was likely used to buy the book that night. Her phone pinged on the store's public Wi-Fi network at 7:35 p.m., then again briefly at 7:42. Then it went dark, powered off or destroyed. It never pinged another tower, and the SIM was never used again. Police subpoenaed her carrier, but the data offered no new direction. The last outgoing text on her phone was to a friend from work the night before. "You ever feel like your dreams are trying to warn you?" It went unanswered. The spiral-bound notebook became the focus of attention early in the investigation. Recovered from her bedroom, it was half filled with disjointed entries, some mundane, others more abstract. Police categorized it as personal writing, mostly poems, observations, and fragments of dialogue. But what drew their attention were the torn pages. Roughly 7 had been removed, clean rips, no shreds left behind. The last intact page, written in black pen and dated October 12th, read, "There's something I think I'm not supposed to remember. It's buried like it wasn't mine to begin with. Investigators marked it as cryptic, but non-actionable." Her family believed it was metaphor, just another piece of unfinished writing. But detectives, especially one assigned early in the case, noted its tone. It didn't sound like fiction. It sounded like fear. Friends were interviewed extensively. One from college said Lana had always been obsessed with memory, and once talked about how easily people forget things they don't want to see. A neighbor claimed Lana had recently started leaving her porch light on all night, which she hadn't done before. Another friend said she'd confided about a former relationship that felt like it had never really ended, but no names were ever given. Social media showed no posts referencing a boyfriend, breakup, or conflict. Her messages, combed by digital forensics, hinted at an emotional decline, but nothing concrete. No arguments, no stalkers, no threats, just isolation, withdrawal, a kind of quiet unraveling no one noticed until she was gone. Her internet history showed several late-night searches that caught investigators' eyes. Can you forget trauma without knowing? How long do suppressed memories last? Is hypnosis dangerous? They weren't recent, most dated back 6 to 8 months before she vanished. But paired with her journal entries, a theory emerged that perhaps Lana hadn't just disappeared from Ridgefield. Maybe she was running from something in her own head, something resurfacing, something she didn't want to know again. Still, theories weren't evidence. Police tracked down every known associate, scanned her email and cloud backups, and searched for possible connections to missing persons or unsolved cases. Nothing matched. No former partners came forward. No workplace incidents. Her prints weren't in any criminal databases. Her family submitted DNA to the National Missing Persons Registry. Her toothbrush, hairbrush, and a sample from an old Band-Aid were preserved. Weeks turned to months. Leads thinned. The last official update from the department stated that Lana's disappearance remained unexplained with no clear evidence of foul play. By the 1-year mark, the notebook was stored in a sealed evidence bag, labeled and filed. Its last page still read the same. "There's something I think I'm not supposed to remember." At the time, that line was dismissed as poetic rambling. But years later, when investigators would come across her writing again, this time hidden where no one expected, they'd look back at that sentence and realize it wasn't rambling. It was a warning. By the 3rd year of silence, hope had mostly withered into ritual. On October 15th, Lana's parents lit the same candle, stood in the same churchyard, and repeated the same lines to the same small group of people. She was still missing. Nothing had changed, but her mother, Darlene Briggs, wasn't done. She believed Lana had left behind more than just a locked car and a checkout receipt. She believed something had scared her daughter, something that hadn't been uncovered, or worse, had been ignored. In early 2017, the Briggs family hired a private investigator named Kira Alden, a retired state trooper with a reputation for reopening doors no one wanted to knock on twice. Alden began with Lana's digital life, not what police had already sifted through, but the backups. With new tools and forensic recovery methods, she pulled data from Lana's cloud that hadn't been visible in 2013. Fragments, metadata, auto-saved cache logs. In that mess, she found something odd: timestamps for 6 incoming text messages during the week before Lana disappeared, none of which appeared in her saved texts. They had been received and deleted quickly. But the text previews had been partially cached in a system file from her messaging app, and one stood out immediately. October 14th, 9:16 p.m. Don't go back. There. Just leave it alone. The message had come from a number not associated with any known contact, and it had been deleted within 2 minutes of receipt. There was no response sent. The remaining messages, 2 from October 10th, 1 on the 11th, and 2 more on the 13th, were too fragmented to read, but all followed a similar pattern: received late at night, no replies, deleted almost immediately. The number was a prepaid phone, purchased in cash in a Vancouver strip mall. No registered owner, no activity before or after that week. A dead end, except for what it implied. Lana had been in communication with someone, and that someone didn't want her returning somewhere. When Alden presented her findings to Ridgefield PD, they reopened portions of the investigation, but quietly. The case had gone cold under public scrutiny. There were no suspects, no sightings, no DNA hits. They couldn't afford another public plea that led nowhere. Instead, a detective was reassigned to work quietly with Alden. Together, they started with the message, "Don't go back there." Back where? The most obvious candidate was the bookstore. It was the last place she'd gone. But by that point, the owner, Reed Merrick, had been interviewed 3 times and searched once. Nothing had turned up. He was cooperative, if withdrawn. The building hadn't changed. Still, Alden wanted to know more. She checked property records. The building had been purchased by Merrick in 1992 after a fire gutted the original interior. There were no blueprints filed with the city since. When she requested the fire damage reports, a page was missing, the section detailing the reconstruction of the upper floor. That same week, Alden requested Lana's belongings from evidence storage. including the copy of Letters to a Young Poet she'd purchased that night. She noted that while the receipt confirmed the book's purchase, the item itself had no fingerprints. Not Lana's, not the clerk's, not even partial smudges. It was too clean. For a book pulled from a dusty second-hand shelf and carried around for 10 minutes, it looked like it had been wiped. When questioned again, the bookstore clerk admitted he didn't remember handling that specific book. He hadn't rung up Lana. His manager, Reed, had taken over at the register just before closing. Something about the end-of-day drawer count. That new detail pushed things further. Merrick had stepped in to ring up a lone customer just before closing, then claimed to remember nothing unusual. When asked why he hadn't shared that detail during initial questioning, he said he forgot. But the pattern was forming. The message telling her not to go back. A wiped book. An owner who remembered very little. And a missing girl who'd seemed terrified of remembering something. Police obtained another warrant for the store, but this time found no irregularities. The upstairs apartment was neat. The store's floorboards were solid. The basement, mostly used for inventory, had nothing suspicious. No recording devices, no false walls, no evidence. Merrick was cleared again. Still, Alden wasn't satisfied. She suspected Lana had returned to the bookstore multiple times in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Surveillance footage from surrounding businesses in that time frame was no longer available, but cell tower data confirmed at least 4 pings near the shop between October 1st and 13th, always late evening. She hadn't bought anything on those days. She hadn't told anyone she was going. So what had she gone back for? A theory began to emerge, one police hadn't considered fully, that Lana wasn't abducted by a stranger. She had walked willingly into something, a conversation, a pattern, a secret, and someone had warned her not to come back. But she did. And after that final visit, she vanished. Alden compiled her findings into a supplemental case file and submitted it to the Ridgefield PD in late 2017. She urged them to pursue the angle of a personal connection, someone Lana knew or had recently reconnected with. But the data wasn't enough for charges, not without a suspect, not without a body. Still, behind closed doors, the focus shifted. Investigators stopped asking where Lana went. They started asking who had known she was going and why they didn't want her to return. For most people in Ridgefield, Reed Merrick was background noise. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't attend town meetings. He didn't drink at the bar or complain about the city council. He simply ran his bookstore, 6 days a week, 12 to 6, closed Sundays, and then disappeared upstairs to the apartment above the shop where he'd lived since the early 90s. Customers remembered him as soft-spoken, often dusty, sometimes hard of hearing. The kind of man who only spoke when spoken to. If you asked, he'd give you a book recommendation, always poetry or historical nonfiction. But if you didn't ask, he wouldn't say a word. Reed Merrick was part of the shop, furniture practically. But when Lana Briggs vanished, people began to look at him differently. Reed was the last known person to see Lana. He admitted that to police from the start. She'd come in shortly before closing, browsed, bought a book, and left. He said she didn't seem upset, wasn't in a hurry, didn't mention anyone waiting. He hadn't walked her to the door. He didn't remember seeing which direction she turned. He told detectives he'd locked up 5 minutes after she left, swept the floor, counted the drawer, and went to bed. He claimed he never saw her again. On paper, that version of events held up. The shop's door logs matched his statement. No one else came in after Lana. No signs of forced entry, no noise complaints from neighbors. But something about Reed's calmness had always unsettled investigators. Too still, too memorized. His record was clean. No arrests, no restraining. Orders, not even a parking ticket. But his life before Ridgefield was a question mark. He'd purchased the bookstore property in 1992 under his legal name, had all the paperwork, had never changed jobs or residences in 30 years. But when detectives tried to verify prior addresses, they found inconsistencies. A P.O. box in Illinois, an unlisted apartment in rural Idaho, several years where his name simply didn't show up on any official record. When questioned about it, Reed said he'd moved around a lot after his wife died, though no marriage certificate or death record was ever found. Pressed further, he became vague, then defensive. He said those years didn't matter, that he came to Ridgefield to be alone. Legally, it wasn't enough to hold him. Still, the bookstore gained a quiet shadow in town. The signs stayed up, the shelves were stocked, but people began to keep their distance. Some locals whispered Reed had always been strange, too focused on his younger female customers, always hanging around the poetry section when they browsed. A former part-time employee, a college student who worked there in 2011, once told police Reed gave her a weird feeling, but never crossed a line. Another employee, never officially interviewed, would later become a key piece of the story. In 2021, nearly 8 years after Lana disappeared, her sister Marianne received an anonymous message through social media. It was a screenshot of a text conversation sent from a burner account. The messages claimed the sender had worked at Wren's Books briefly and had quit after Reed's behavior became uncomfortable. According to the texts, Reed had a specific interest in Lana, always watching her when she came in, marking which books she touched, even writing her name in a ledger once under the word frequent. The sender said they'd tried to tell someone once but were discouraged. The message ended with, "He was obsessed." I don't think she knew Marianne brought the message to police, but because it came anonymously and no original device could be traced, it went nowhere. No one ever stepped forward. The tip was archived and left cold. But it left a mark. Investigators went back through Reed's original interview tapes, re-listened to his tone. It was calm, too calm. They reviewed his handwriting on store receipts, even, steady. They noted the way he described Lana's final visit, measured, unfeeling. Not casual, but not concerned, just clinical. By 2023, Reed Merrick was 69 years old. He rarely left the apartment upstairs. Neighbors said he seemed thinner, slower, barely came outside except to pick up mail. On April 4th, he was found unresponsive in his armchair, a stack of newspapers beside him, the TV still on. Natural causes. No family came forward. He was cremated, and the property was left in probate. The bookstore shuttered the following month. When news spread of his death, Lana's name resurfaced briefly in town. People asked again if police had ever been sure about him. Some said they'd always believed he had something to do with it. Others said it was unfair to speak ill of a man who'd never been charged. But most people quietly agreed on one thing. Reed Merrick had secrets. And now he'd taken them with him. What no one knew then, not Marianne, not the police, not the new owner who would eventually take over the lease, was that one of those secrets hadn't left. It had stayed, sealed inside a wall, waiting. By 2025, the bookstore had become a relic, its windows clouded with dust, signage sun-faded and chipped. For nearly 2 years after Reed Merrick's death, the property sat vacant, caught in legal limbo. Locals passed by without a glance. No one asked when it would reopen. Some hoped it wouldn't. But in June of that year, a new name quietly appeared on the deed. Nora Holbrook, a former university librarian looking to start fresh after retiring early. She wanted to restore the shop into a community reading space, book clubs, author talks, a small cafe in the back. The purchase was practical. The renovation wasn't meant to stir ghosts, but within days, it did. Nora hired a small team of workers to begin clearing out the cluttered rear of the building, a maze of shelving units, storage trunks, and unopened boxes that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Most of it was mundane. Old tax records, water-damaged encyclopedias, bags of discarded bookmarks. But one worker noticed something odd, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that didn't match the others. It was bolted to the wall, sealed at the base, and unlike the others, had no visible screws or brackets. When pushed, it gave slightly, just enough to suggest it wasn't part of the original structure. They removed the adjacent shelves and found a faint line along the right-hand edge, a seam in the drywall that had been carefully painted over. Behind it, a narrow cavity extended about 4 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The crawl space had no lighting, no venting, no insulation. Just silence. Inside were several broken chairs, an overturned table, 2 empty wine bottles, and a strong, musty odor that hit immediately when the wall came down. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs hung like curtains. But one object stood out against the dim clutter, a heavy, rusted trunk with a steel padlock pushed into the back corner beneath an old curtain rod. Police were called before anything was touched further. When detectives arrived, they carefully pried open the trunk. Inside were neatly folded articles of clothing, women's jeans, 3 faded tank tops, and a navy blue jacket. The styles were early 2010s, consistent with the period of Lana Briggs's disappearance. Atop the clothing lay a stack of composition notebooks, all water-damaged but intact, their covers labeled only with dates. And beneath those, sealed in a warped Ziploc bag, was a familiar object, one that investigators hadn't seen in 12 years. It was the same copy of Letters to a Young Poet Lana had purchased the night she vanished. The receipt was still tucked inside, time-stamped 7:42 p.m. The pages were stained with age, curled at the edges. The spine had split. But on the inside front cover, written in Lana's known handwriting, was a single line. "If anyone finds this, please read the last page." Investigators didn't open the book immediately. They documented everything. The trunk was sealed again, transported to the crime lab, and logged under a new case ID. The notebooks were too fragile to flip through on site. The trunk also contained a plastic pouch with 3 VHS tapes, no labels, just black spines and tape numbers scrawled in faded silver marker. 1, 2, 3. The discovery triggered an automatic case escalation, and within 48 hours, the Lana Briggs file was officially reopened. News spread fast. By the end of the week, regional media had caught wind of new evidence in the Lana Briggs cold case. Detectives released no details publicly, only that a significant development had been made during routine property renovation. Marianne Briggs, now 39, received a personal call from the lead detective. Her reaction was quiet, almost mechanical. She'd waited 12 years for a break. Now that it had come, her voice simply cracked. "Is she alive?" The answer, at that point, was unknown. The presence of the poetry book inside the crawlspace was enough to link the discovery directly to Lana. But the notebooks, and especially the tapes, suggested something else, something more complex than a random abduction or a hasty escape. Someone had preserved these items deliberately. Someone had sealed them behind drywall, hidden them behind a fake bookshelf, and never spoken of them again. Whether it was Reed Merrick or someone else was still an open question, but the careful concealment indicated intent, not panic. The building was declared a crime scene. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the crawlspace and surrounding walls. No human remains were found. Forensic teams cataloged the dust layers, confirming the wall had likely been sealed between 2013 and 2014. Every screw, nail, and scrap of material was photographed. One particularly telling discovery was made near the wine bottles, a melted candle stub and a matchbook from a Portland motel, dated 2012. Investigators couldn't explain the connection yet, but it hinted at movement. Someone traveling, someone returning, someone watching. In the coming days, the notebooks would be carefully opened, scanned, and analyzed. The tapes would be played, cautiously and in private, but none of that happened immediately. For the moment, what mattered was this. Lana Briggs had not vanished without a trace. She had left something behind, something someone else tried very hard to bury. And now, for the first time in 12 years, the question wasn't if something had happened to her. It was how much. She'd tried to tell them before the wall went up. The tapes were unmarked except for the hand-scrawled numbers on the spines, 1, 2, and 3, and each had to be handled with extreme care. Forensic technicians transferred the analog contents to digital format in a sealed room at the state crime lab, avoiding a public chain of custody to prevent leaks. No one outside the investigative circle knew what had been found inside that trunk. Not yet. Tape 1 was largely static, flashes of what looked like the storage room itself, empty with only ambient noise and the occasional creak of floorboards. Tape 2 showed similar footage but appeared to have been recorded from a lower angle, possibly a tripod facing a blank wall. Background sounds suggested someone walking, pacing, but it wasn't until they played tape 3 that the case shifted from mystery to nightmare. It opened with a dim, grainy shot of a slanted ceiling, the kind typical of old attics. A single lamp with a yellow bulb cast light across the space. Shadows stretched along the floor. The camera was fixed, no movement, no zoom, likely placed on a shelf or nailed stand. For the first 30 seconds, there was no one in the frame. Then, a young woman stepped into view and sat cross-legged on a folded blanket. She was wearing a dark sweatshirt and jeans. Her hair was matted at the sides, her posture hunched as if her body had forgotten how to hold itself upright. She looked directly into the camera, not with defiance or fear, but a kind of hollow resignation. And then she spoke. "I'll read it again," she said softly, and opened a book that matched the cover of Letters to a Young Poet. She began to read, her voice shaking, the words coming slowly. "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart." At times she paused as if struggling to continue. Her hands trembled. She kept wiping her nose, but there was no tissue. Her eyes were swollen. Midway through the reading, she broke off and whispered, "Please, I already did this one." In the background, a figure moved, just a silhouette, tall, male, partially obscured by the attic's wooden beams. He didn't speak. He didn't step into the light. He simply passed by, back and forth, then stood still for several minutes before vanishing from the frame entirely. The woman flinched when he moved, but didn't stop reading. She turned the pages methodically, as if waiting for something, or fulfilling a task she no longer believed would end. The timestamp on the footage read, October 19th, 2013. 4 days after Lana Briggs was reported missing. Investigators froze the frame. They analyzed facial structure, voice pattern, and body movement. While the video was too dark and degraded to make a 100% visual confirmation, the vocal analysis was more precise. Forensic audio experts matched the woman's speech patterns, vowel usage, and cadence to recorded samples from Lana's voicemail and college radio interviews. The probability of a match exceeded 97%. It was her. Technicians also examined the footage for signs of tampering, compression anomalies, digital insertions, frame mismatches. None were found. The footage was continuous. The lighting was consistent. The camera had no cuts. The background noises, pipes, faint creaks, the distant sound of a siren matched ambient patterns from Ridgefield during that week in October. The footage was authentic. And it was not a performance. It was documentation. They had been watching a woman held captive. The attic visible in the tape bore features that matched the architecture of the bookstore's upper floor, specifically the slanted ceiling, the recessed beams, and the aged paneling along the side wall. Investigators compared the footage to old photographs taken during an initial walkthrough in 2013. But those images showed a closed storage room with no visible access to an attic space. If this room existed, it had been deliberately hidden, and whoever had filmed that tape had full control of it. But there was no audio from the man, no clear view of his face, no interaction caught on tape that could prove identity. And with Reed Merrick deceased, formal charges were off the table. The official press statement released by Ridgefield Police was cautious. They confirmed the reopening of the Lana Briggs investigation and acknowledged the discovery of items relevant to the case. No mention of tapes, no mention of the woman in the attic, only the phrase, potential evidence under review. Privately, however, the investigative team knew exactly what they were seeing. Lana Briggs had not vanished into thin air. She had been confined, monitored, and recorded. And now they had proof, not just of her presence, but of someone else's control. It was no longer a question of whether she had left voluntarily. It was a question of how long she had been alive inside that attic, waiting for someone to find her. After reviewing the tapes, investigators turned their full attention to the upper floor of the building, what had once been Reed Merrick's private residence. The apartment had been mostly stripped during probate, flooring removed, appliances gone, walls half demolished, but something didn't add up. The layout didn't fully match the building's original blueprints from 1992. One measurement in particular, a 5-foot discrepancy along the western wall, suggested a space unaccounted for. The area aligned with the position of an old, long-disused chimney stack. When officers examined it closely, they noticed that the bricks forming the rear column were of a slightly different shade, sealed with newer mortar. A tap test confirmed it, hollow behind the stack. With a warrant approved and forensic architects on site, the wall was carefully removed. Behind it was a narrow doorway, unmarked without a knob, covered by plywood and insulation. When they breached it, the room inside was smaller than expected, 9 feet by 11. The air was stagnant, heavy with dust and something else harder to describe. Mold, iron, the smell of old fear. The space had been soundproofed, thick insulation, foam lining beneath drywall, layers of rubber sealant along the doorframe. It hadn't been designed for storage. It had been designed not to be heard. There was no window, no vent, just a single light bulb hanging from an exposed wire and the outline of furniture long since removed. Dust patterns suggested a cot or mattress had once sat in the far corner. A shallow dresser was built into the wall, and inside it, buried beneath a piece of deteriorated canvas, were 4 lengths of nylon restraints, cracked and frayed. One still had rusted hardware attached, likely from a bed frame that had since been discarded. Crime scene technicians began swabbing immediately. Along the baseboards and under the dresser lip, they found traces of dried blood. On a beam near the doorway, they found strands of hair later confirmed to match Lana Briggs's DNA. A faded stain along the far corner carpet tested positive for both blood and saliva. None of it was fresh. All of it had aged in silence. But what struck them most was the wall itself. Scratched into the paneling just beside the doorframe were 3 vertical claw marks, deep, jagged, and overlapping as if made by fingernails over time. The wall beneath was scuffed and dented, the paint rubbed away in patches from repeated friction, and written in black pen, its ink faded to a ghostly gray, was a message. This was my 2nd birthday here. The team went still. The implication was immediate. Lana hadn't been held for days, not weeks, but years. She had survived inside this room for at least 2 birthdays. Investigators traced back the construction of the soundproofing and estimated that the modifications were made sometime between 2012 and 2013, before Lana ever disappeared. That detail was chilling. The room hadn't been improvised. It had been planned, built ahead of time. Reed Merrick, or someone connected to him, had created a hidden chamber in which a person could be concealed, unseen, unheard, and completely contained. As the team documented every square inch, another detail emerged. Under the floorboards near the wall with the claw marks, they found a small hole, poked clean through the insulation. On the other side was an air duct that ran downward behind the main store. Not enough to offer ventilation, but enough for sound to leak through. Investigators now believe Lana may have spent months, maybe years, hearing muffled conversations, floor creaks, and customer footsteps, just feet below her. Alive above the very shop she'd walked into the night she vanished, they found no bones, no remains. But they found fragments of a journal, pages stuffed behind the insulation, barely legible but enough to reconstruct snippets. I heard the rain again today. He says I can leave when I forget the thing I'm not supposed to remember. And another, more recent-looking page. Please don't stop looking. The final assessment was grim. Lana Briggs had not been abducted and taken away. She had been hidden in place, the same building where volunteers had searched, where officers had stood, where neighbors had walked past for a decade. She had been above them, waiting, writing, fading. The forensic team concluded that based on biological evidence, Lana had likely remained in that room for over 2 years before she either died or was moved. The lack of skeletal remains made definitive conclusions impossible. But what was undeniable now was this: Her disappearance was not a clean vanishing. It was confinement, sustained, methodical, and executed in plain sight. The attic had been a prison, and it had always been there, just behind the bricks. 2 weeks after the attic room was discovered and sealed, forensic teams returned to the bookstore's lower level to resume their sweep, this time focusing on overlooked gaps, crawl spaces, and any remaining vents that hadn't been cataloged during the original 2013 investigation. In a rear corner of the old storage space, behind a filing cabinet partially collapsed from rot, one technician noticed a floor vent that seemed out of place. It wasn't connected to any functioning HVAC line. It had no draft, no airflow, no accumulation of dust in the slats. When they removed the grill cover, they found a shallow metal pocket inside, no more than 4 inches deep, and within it, 5 tightly folded scraps of yellowed paper, each wedged between a mesh screen and the duct wall. Every note was written in small, careful handwriting. The ink had faded unevenly, but it was legible. One read simply, "He said no one remembers the ones who scream." Another, "Do they know the air comes in from here?" The third listed dates, 14 in total, written in sequence. Some matched known milestones in the Lana Briggs case: the night she disappeared, the first day of search parties, the day her parents held a vigil. But others were less clear. Possibly personal anniversaries, or, as one investigator later theorized, days when she was promised she'd be let go. But it was the fourth scrap that changed everything. It read, "Reed Merrick is not his real name. Look up Calvin Shore. He told me before he got sick." The handwriting matched samples from Lana's high school notebooks, her journal, and the pages recovered from the attic. No question. These were written by her and hidden intentionally. The final scrap bore only a partial sentence, as if torn from a larger page. "I heard her once. I think she was before me." That note sent a wave of silence through the team. Investigators now wondered if Lana had not been the first, or the only. The name Calvin Shore triggered no immediate alerts in the system, but once run against historic criminal databases, a hit emerged from Michigan, dated 1979, a case file from Livingston County. The victim, 16-year-old Frances Hale, last seen entering a used bookstore in rural Howell, Michigan. The owner at the time was listed as a temporary manager named Calvin Shore. No witnesses, nobody, no security footage. The case had collapsed due to lack of forensic evidence. Shore was never charged. He disappeared within 6 months of the investigation stalling. At the time, Michigan authorities believed he had skipped town and changed jobs. No one had followed the trail. Now, with a name and timeline in hand, the connection finally surfaced. Reed Merrick, the quiet bookstore owner in Ridgefield, Oregon, had legally changed his name in 1991, 2 years before he purchased the property in Oregon. The records showed he'd filed the change while living in Idaho under an assumed address. The fingerprint match had never triggered nationally because of a clerical error during the 1979 case. Shore had been fingerprinted, but the file was misclassified and never uploaded to the digital system when the National Registry went online. Investigators now had a confirmed link between Lana Briggs and a man tied to a decades-old disappearance with nearly identical circumstances. What shocked detectives even more was how close they'd been. In 2013, when they ran Merrick's background, everything came back clean. The name, the social, the property deeds, all legitimate. But the paper trail before 1992 had always been described as murky, not suspicious. Now they knew why. He'd buried his past so completely that even local records had failed to raise alarms. The system had failed twice, once in 1979, then again in 2013. With the new information, the Michigan case was reopened in coordination with Oregon authorities. Files were re-examined, old witnesses contacted. Frances Hale's family was informed that the man long suspected of being involved in their daughter's disappearance had surfaced in another state under a new identity and may have repeated the crime. The media still hadn't been told the full truth. The Ridgefield Police Department kept their statement conservative, citing new historical connections under investigation. But internally, everything had changed. This wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a pattern, and Lana had figured it out. Somewhere in those final months, possibly during one of his illnesses or a moment of arrogance, Reed had told her who he really was. She wrote it down, folded it into scraps, and slid it through a vent she hoped someone would eventually find. She didn't run. She recorded. She labeled. She left behind breadcrumbs for a case that was never meant to be solved. And for the first time since 2013, investigators no longer believed she had been chosen at random. She had been chosen on purpose. Forensic analysts spent weeks inside the bookstore, studying every inch of wood, brick, and drywall that had gone unnoticed for over a decade. What they pieced together was a design so deliberate, so tightly executed, that it felt less like an afterthought and more like architecture with intent. Reed Merrick, or Calvin Shore, as they now knew him, had not just hidden Lana. He had built a space where someone could live without ever being seen, heard, or even suspected. Permit records from 2008, filed under the pretense of attic reinforcement and personal workspace upgrades, included vague language about insulation, noise reduction, and shelving reconstruction. The building inspector at the time signed off after a single walkthrough, never realizing that a false wall had already been erected behind the chimney column. Photos from the original inspection showed a closed door where none now existed. Over the years, Merrick had sealed it completely, blending drywall into brick, papering over seams with paint and shelving. The hidden room's construction was far more advanced than expected. Layers of soundproofing had been installed, double-thick foam padding, rubber vibration mats under the floor, and acoustic tiles above the ceiling. The floor joists had been reinforced, not for weight, but to prevent sound from carrying downward. A fake vent was cut through to allow minimal air circulation, and electrical access was routed through his upstairs apartment. The single bulb inside that attic chamber had its switch embedded in a cabinet on the opposite wall, accessible only from Reed's side of the residence. A hidden entrance was later uncovered inside a false cabinet in his apartment, hinged drywall tucked behind canned goods and old books. When pressed just right, it popped inward, revealing a narrow crawl space leading directly to the attic cell. Police missed it during the 2013 investigation because the apartment had never raised suspicion and no cause had justified a structural audit. Now, with the full picture visible, it became clear that Reed had built this space with a singular purpose. Recovered journals, those found inside the vent, the trunk, and several stashed behind insulation, were cataloged chronologically. The earliest dated entry was from November 2013, roughly a month after Lana vanished. It began shakily, as if written under watch or in stolen moments. Later entries grew longer, more fragmented, with drawings, tally marks, and a mixture of despair and lucidity. There were stretches where she documented daily patterns, when she was fed, what she heard downstairs, what he said. One entry simply read, "He talks to me like I'm a reflection he's afraid of." But as the journals continued, a disturbing timeline emerged. Lana had survived for at least 2.5 years. Entries dated as late as April 2016 included references to seasons, specific world events she overheard on television, and even mentions of illness, chronic headaches, fever, and trouble breathing. Medical attention was never mentioned. There were no signs she was ever taken to a doctor. Then the writing stopped. The last known entry, dated April 9, 2016, read, "If I'm still here when the leaves come back, I'll try again. But I think my body is done waiting." No further pages were found. No later scraps appeared in the vent or crawl space. Biological evidence recovered from the floor beneath the insulation showed high concentrations of dried blood, trace amounts of vomit, and decayed organic tissue. Forensic pathologists believe the pattern was consistent with prolonged illness, possibly untreated infection, sepsis, or internal hemorrhaging. But without remains, they could not confirm a cause of death. The absence of a body became its own evidence. There was no trace of decomposition, no smell noted by neighbors, no insect activity recorded during any of the prior years. It was as if, once she died, she vanished again. Investigators now believe Reed removed her body quietly, methodically. The rear alley offered discreet access. A set of notes found in his handwriting, discovered inside a locked drawer in his bedroom, referenced final cleanup, weather delay, and a line that read, "She won't be in the way anymore. I've made peace with it." He likely disposed of her remains far from Ridgefield. No GPS data, no receipts, no known vehicle matching his name ever left the state during that time. Without a body, the case could never be ruled a homicide, but it also could no longer be called a disappearance. What Reed Merrick had built was not just a room, it was a vanishing machine, a place where someone could be erased in increments, first from the street, then from memory, and finally from time. Lana Briggs had not vanished. She had been removed, silently. And still, even without remains, her words, buried in vents, stuffed in books, scratched into walls, had spoken louder than anything Reed Merrick ever said. The bookstore didn't last long after the truth came out. In early fall of 2025, city officials met with Lana Briggs's family, investigators, and community members to decide what should happen to the building that had kept her secret for 12 years. It had already become a symbol of silence, of failure, of something broken hiding in plain sight. No one wanted to reopen it. No one wanted to walk through the front door again. The town council voted unanimously for demolition. By November, the structure was gone. The roof came down first, then the front windows shattered beneath a hydraulic claw. A small crowd watched from behind safety barriers, many of them older now, holding the same grief they'd carried since 2013. Beneath the debris, no further evidence was found. No body, no additional pages, no signs of where Reed Merrick had taken her. The destruction felt less like closure and more like exhalation, like finally breathing out after holding it in too long. In its place, the town approved plans for a memorial garden. Not large, just a patch of green, bordered by benches and river stones, with a single bronze plaque anchored to what used to be the bookstore's front step. The inscription read, "For Lana Briggs, and all who were never heard in time." The garden opened quietly, without ceremony. But people visited. Every day, someone left something: flowers, paper cranes, a copy of Lana's favorite book, always sealed in plastic to keep the rain out. And in the middle of the garden, where a single rosebush had been planted, a weatherproof display case held a copy of The Room Upstairs, a slim, bound collection of Lana's restored journal pages, printed in a limited run and released by her sister Marianne with help from the local historical society. The book was spare, raw, unedited. Lana's handwriting had been preserved as images beside each transcription. The pages spanned her time in captivity: fragmented thoughts, whispered memories, sketches of the room, and reflections that sometimes read like poetry but never felt like fiction. Her words were plain, sharp, and deliberate. One passage simply read, "There's no clock here, but I think he keeps time by watching me lose it." The final page was something no one expected. Found months after the investigation had ended, tucked inside a water-damaged envelope beneath a floorboard of the attic, folded around a torn bookstore receipt from 2013. The ink was faint, almost lost to mold, but forensic restoration made the message legible. It read, "I want to be found. Even if I'm not here anymore." That line became the book's closing page. It became the memorial's inscription. It became the thing people remembered most. The DNA confirmation from the VHS tapes had settled any lingering doubt. The voice was Lana's. The hair samples in the attic, the dried saliva on the wall, the blood beneath the insulation, all matched her profile. The room hadn't just held someone, it had held her for over 2 years. In October of that same year, exactly 12 years to the day after she vanished, the town gathered for a candlelight vigil at the site. Nearly 200 people came. Some had searched for her in 2013, others had forgotten her name until the story came back. but no one stood there without the weight of it. Marianne spoke briefly. She didn't read a speech. She just held the book in her hands and said, "She left the light on. We just didn't see it." That night, the garden stayed open until morning. The candles burned low. Some flickered out early, drowned by the wind. Others held on longer. What lingered afterward wasn't just grief. It was awareness that buildings keep secrets, that silence doesn't mean safety, that a locked door might not be all there is. People started looking differently at old structures, back rooms, and sealed attics. There was no panic, no moral crusade, just a quiet shift in how things were seen. And in Ridgefield, no one walked past the corner of Hayward and Edding Street without stopping, even for a second, just to look, just to remember. The bookstore had held her all along, behind dust, behind silence. Now everyone knows.